going to say a couple of words. Dr. David Shneer, Director of the Program of Jewish Studies at the University of Colorado Boulder, Professor of History, Louis P. Singer, Endowed Chair in Jewish History. I'll let you take it away.
I actually want to start by thanking Melinda, who is futzing with technology, but I wanted to pay attention because I really want to thank you for allowing this room to engage with your personal story, to relate to it, to not relate to it, or in my case, to scrutinize it and figure out what it means, like why you're doing this project, why we're all here. And I titled my comments "The Haunting of American Jewry" because I feel like I need a title. I needed a personal hook, so you'll get a little personal hook from me. And since Greg Drinkwater told you that he's my husband, we didn't coordinate our outfits today. But we, which I noticed as he was speaking, that we're dressed more or less the same. But our relationships to Germany are actually radically different. And we came together, ironically, writing a travel guide to Germany. He with an earnestness to write about his home, his sort of a fond place of his childhood, and me to write with an ironic twist of fate, since I was raised in a Jewish household. So when I was growing up in the 1970s, I was told that Jews don't buy Volkswagens. Mind you, we drove a Datsun, or today's Nissan, a scrappy little Japanese car, so the issue wasn't really about supporting domestic car production or about not buying from America's enemies during World War II. The ban on Volkswagen in my household and in broader American Jewish consciousness was about a very particular enemy of American Jewry, Nazi Germany, which also happened to be the adversary of the United States after Pearl Harbor, which brought the United States into World War II. My grandfather was also deeply disappointed with me when I decided to study German in high school. Why would you want to learn the language of those who murdered Jews? Never mind that German is a language of Jewish culture, too. Everything German in my household was tainted, at least in the household that I grew up in 1970s America. But it wasn't always so. The letter from Cloudcroft is actually about two historical moments. The first, that of the film's protagonist, the first protagonist, because actually there are two protagonists in the film. The first protagonist, Private Sandy Hess, and the second, the present moment that we and the filmmaker and our second protagonist, Private Hess's daughter, Melinda Hess, occupy. The first story is the historical one, the one that took place in 1946, the year when these letters underpinning the project were written. His story takes place immediately after a world war that transformed America's relationships to its Jewish population and Jews' relationship to America. It was during the war that American society shifted radically from one that had been defined as a Christian society, or a Protestant society more specifically, to this word Judeo-Christian, which you may have heard of. It was coined during World War II. It was in the immediate post-war period that numerous clausus restrictions at universities for Jews were lifted, when the Supreme Court ruled these residential covenants where Jews could or could not live, when those were lifted. And it was when American Jews, to me this is actually one of the most important parts, came to define Cold War-era American intellectual life in journals like the American Jewish Committee's Commentary. How many of you have heard of Commentary magazine? Just out of curiosity. So in the 50s and 60s, it was the intellectual magazine, and very few people know that it was a project of American Jewry. We cannot understand the first story, the one taking place immediately after the war, if we don't remember that the United States was much more concerned about the communist Soviet Union, about keeping the nation strong and free, at least according to Mickey. And I was editing as I was hearing what other people were saying, so I put that in after watching the Mickey Mouse clip. Then the lingering memories of World War II and Nazi atrocities against Jews and others, what came to be called the Holocaust. With its establishments in 1949, West Germany became not only an important American ally in Europe, but was considered the front line in the battle with communism. Germans were not only no longer the enemy, they were our friends. And German consumer goods, whose production was paid for with U.S. government Marshall Plan money, eventually arrived in American markets, and some of them were, in fact, wildly successful. And no single German product symbolizes how quickly the former enemy became America's erstwhile partner. Then the car that my family warned me against, the Volkswagen. and in particular that cute little VW called the Beetle. A pet project of Hitler himself, Nazi Germany developed the Volkswagen, or the people's car, Volkswagen, to build popular support for the regime and to foster a self-sufficient economy. None other than John Foster Dulles, who was the Secretary of State under Eisenhower, was so into the car that he owned two of them. He had two Volkswagen Beetles, a fact that was considered so important that it made news, big news, in the West German press. In the second half of the 1950s, the Beetle was hugely popular among white middle-class American consumers precisely at the height of the Cold War. Although they might not have been its most ardent consumers, American Jews did not protest its sale or organize boycotts. For one, because American Jews in the post-war period had positioned themselves as good Americans, advocates of a civil rights-minded yet anti-communist agenda. Publicly protesting products from America's key European ally, das passt nicht, as they say in Yiddish. It would have been in bad taste. As for Nazi atrocities, although American Jews discussed Nazi atrocities amongst themselves extensively in the post-war period, they tended to do it among themselves. If domestic civil rights and anti-communism defined a secular American Jewish identity of the 50s and 60s, in the late 60s and 70s, international issues came to define secular American Jewish identity. Think about these kinds of issues. The Holocaust, the state of Israel, and the plight of Soviet Jewry became significant, especially after Israel's victory in the 1967 Six-Day War, which a lot of people were watching and fearing that it was an existential crisis for Israel. American Jews after that became more nationalistic, advocating for their own rather than someone else's rights, and often doing so on a global scale. And it's also the period when you see American Jewry really become connected to Israel. So you see, for example, Israeli pronunciation of Hebrew replacing the immigrant Eastern European pronunciation of Hebrew that had dominated Jewish schools in the 10s through the 60s. It's in the 1970s when the Israeli pronunciation comes to be the way it's taught. It's when Jewish institutions start universally flying the Israeli flag in their synagogues. Israeli Independence Day becomes a key date on the American Jewish calendar. At the same time, the Holocaust reminded Jews that despite their newfound integration, racial privilege, and high socioeconomic status in American society, they nonetheless could claim the mantle of persecuted minority. One permitted a bit of nationalism, given what they went through in Germany. And it is in this context, I would argue, that we need to understand the film project. So the first story. It's about a Jewish engineer working in the deserts of the Southwest, far from his Manhattan, New York home, as the American assigned to work with 80 German scientists and engineers who were so-called prisoners of peace. This was their sort of sardonic way of calling their situation in the deserts. Many of these scientists had worked on Nazi Germany's V-1 and V-2 rockets, which we've been hearing, the ones that pummeled the British home front through the end of World War II. And, as we've heard, many of them were active Nazis, who should have been brought up on war crimes charges after the war. Instead, in a moment of expediency, the U.S. helped cleanse their biographies and brought these scientists and engineers to the Texas and New Mexico deserts to develop America's Cold War-era missiles. But the first story and letter from Cloudcroft is actually not about them. It's about Private Sandy Hess, a 21-year-old city college man, as he repeats several times in the little scraps of letters that some of us had access to, which is code, by the way. It's not just I graduated from a place, it's code. It's code for an upwardly mobile, highly educated, and explicitly Jewish man of the 1930s and 40s. As historian Ronnie Greenberg has shown, City College, where my own grandfather graduated, the one who warned me against buying Volkswagens and learning German, he studied there in the late 20s. It was the institution transforming American Jewish immigrant men, and it was gender-segregated colleges. The City College was for men. It was training these immigrant men and developing something that she calls an American Jewish masculinity. This masculinity, the one that Private Hess identified with, and, as I think Melinda pointed out, the one that got him his job, as we see in one of the letters, was not defined by WASP notions of masculinity, defined by valor, sport, and service in the military. A masculinity forged in boarding schools, for example, or West Point, as Greg Drinkwater's family was forged, or in New England Ivy League schools. And as you heard Dr. Mecklenburg call it, it was the Harvard for the proletarians, but more specifically the word Jews actually should probably be inserted there as well. City-college masculinity was one whose weapon was the mind, not the body, and whose greatest skill was the art of debate. His repeated reference to his city-college degree was a rather pointed statement to make for an engineer who's designing missiles in the desert so that the graduates of West Point and the brand new Air Force Academy could then use them in battle. When Private Hess writes about himself as a city-college man, he is proudly proclaiming his own Jewish American masculinity. Like a wasp in a similar position would proclaim if he said he was a Harvard man, a claim that has as much to do with American masculinity and class privilege as it does with an elite education. Hess's letters reveal an excitement at the prospect of working with the German scientists. He talks about how, these are his words, enthused he is to work with such a brilliant group of rocket scientists. And in another letter, this is my favorite way he puts it, he describes them as a wonderful collection of brains. He's never more effusive than when he gets the opportunity to meet, quote, the man who knows more about rockets than anyone else in the world, Dr. Werner von Braun, the founder of the German Rocket Society, the rocket division of the Wehrmacht, whom Hess suggests was almost single-handedly responsible for designing the V-1 and V-2 rockets, which, by the way, the V stands for the German Vergeltung, or revenge. So these are revenge rockets developed at the very end of the war, when they're losing the war. The young scientist is almost blinded by the star quality of von Braun. And if he had left it at that, the letters would frankly be much less interesting than they are. Private Hess is indeed starstruck, but he's also nervous about his relations at Fort Bliss precisely because he's a Jew. He wonders in one letter what the Germans would think if they found out that he was Jewish, even though he suspects that they may already know in this one passage in the letter. Hess finds himself in the closet, and I'm using that word intentionally here, about his identity. This notion of the closet, which Eve Kosowski-Sedgwick argues defines invisible minority identities, so identities that are not visible racially or ethnically or in dress. And usually it's referred to about gay and lesbian identities. Although he writes to his parents as a proud Jew, out on Fort Bliss, surrounded by German scientists, as Sedgwick suggests about the closet, he doesn't know who has the power over his identity. If the Germans already know that he's Jewish, then his revelation saying, I am Jewish to them, would be undermined by their confirmation of the obvious. He would be embarrassed by his presumption of their anti-Semitism and his fear of mistreatment upon revelation. And if they don't know, then they might lash out at him with what he presumes would be their latent anti-Semitism, because he does know that these are Nazi scientists. And his revelation would negatively affect his career. Either way, the Germans hold the power over his Jewish identity at Fort Bliss, not him. His letters were written to his parents, Mr. and Mrs. J. Hess, as the address says, Julius and Lillian, who lived in Manhattan on West 176th Street, 40 blocks north of City College, and in the heart of the Washington Heights German Jewish ghetto that we heard discussed earlier. As a 21-year-old recent graduate from the school down the street, his parents must have been terrified about the prospect of their son moving across the country to work on secret military projects, ones whose truths could only be revealed after the fact, let alone the fact of him working with Nazi scientists. Thus, the first story and letter from Cloudcroft is about the 1946 letters from a 21-year-old City College man to his German Jewish parents, who needed their son to provide them some kind of reassurance, especially after the trauma of World War II, which devastated the Washington Heights community, as they watched their homeland cannibalizing itself. Although the Hesses had been in the U.S. for a while, most of their neighbors were recent migrants, which we heard about, exiled from Hitler's Germany. This has to have been weighing on them as they nervously opened a letter from their son to read the opening words, quote, "Let me immediately ease your mind." It's not very often that you open a letter with that sentence. Whether or not their minds were eased, no one will ever know. After all, the majority of the letters are about the intricacies of his research with German scientists, some of them important Nazi figures, about whom Mr. and Mrs. J. Hess must have had their suspicions. But the haunting story of World War II, of the horrors of German treatment of Jews, is not the dominant lens through which Private Hess understood his letters to his parents. He's much more excited to talk to them about science, and about, frankly, how he's making it professionally, which was, frankly, probably the biggest concern for his parents, probably more so than the fact that he was working with former Nazis. Now the second story, which in my opinion is just as interesting as the first, and it takes place not in 1946, but right now here in this room. It's about us and the second intergenerational conversation going on in these letters. In the second story, the letters are still from Private Hess, but now they're not addressed to his parents living in a traumatized German Jewish emigre community, but down a generation to his daughter Melinda. She finds these mysterious letters that, of course, weren't addressed to her since she didn't exist in 1946. But they nonetheless speak to her so loudly that she has a hard time understanding their power over her. After all, they're just mundane letters from a kid to his parents about some military projects that might hold little interest to Melinda if they had been written by anybody else. But of course they weren't written by anybody else. They were written from her father to her grandparents and are a window onto a man who had not revealed himself to her as much as she would have liked. She and we are far removed from the lived traumas of World War II, but now inhabit a world that 21-year-old Private Hess couldn't understand. In 2012, with the U.S. Holocaust Museum on the National Mall, films, courses, memorials, museums, and other manifestations of institutionalized Holocaust memory, we are now so saturated with the Holocaust that we cannot not see the story of an American Jewish engineer working with German V-2 rocket scientists through the lens of the Holocaust. We keep looking for slips, elisions, or evidence, I put evidence in quotes, in the letters that this young man secretly dreaded his assignment with these presumed anti-Semites. We try to read his excitement for working with the best rocket scientists in the world who happen to be from Germany as a mask he put on to reassure his parents. At least that's what I was doing, as we search for his deeper existential anxiety about working with those who we know mass murdered Jews. The short trailer, how many of you have seen the short trailer that's on the website? This is the 2-minute. So I encourage you to go take a look at it. The short trailer reminds us that 1946 is a long way from 2012. Accompanied by lush, romantic piano music meant to evoke love and memory, the trailer pans over yellowing letters. There's no voiceover, no interpretation. The letters go by too quickly, really, to be read, unless, like me, you stop so you can actually see what some of these letters are saying. The goal of the trailer is to evoke a world 60 years past and one psychically distant from ours, even if it takes place right here in Cloudcroft, where we find ourselves. This distance between then and now reaches a fevered pitch as the camera pans over one particular letter near the end of the trailer. In it, Private Hess nonchalantly describes meeting Dr. von Braun for the first time. Private Hess sings the brilliant scientist's praises to his parents as the one who invented the rockets. His parents likely had no idea who he was, since early American press reports about this project don't mention people by name. I actually searched, they didn't mention von Braun by name. They do mention the project, though. So Hess takes a line or two to actually tell his parents why it's so cool that he's getting to work with this amazing guy, von Braun. On this occasion, Melinda does not let the letter speak for itself. In this moment, she draws our attention to it, highlighting it, as if to say, look at this. He's not just writing about being impressed by German scientists. He's now writing about a Nazi scientist, a former member of the SS, who invented rockets that killed tens, if not hundreds of thousands. This is the man who used slave labor for his military projects. And just think, the highlight seems to be calling at us or pointing a finger at us. If Nazi Germany had developed nuclear technology, the very technology being developed in a different desert in the Southwest, this man would have been responsible for the murder of millions. At least this is what I'm hearing in this highlight. From our vantage point, with the accumulation of knowledge that we now have, Melinda seems to be saying that she, and maybe even we, actually have a hard time understanding how a nice American Jewish boy from Manhattan, a city college man at that, doesn't consider the German scientists with whom he's assigned to work, and von Braun in particular, who's the worst of them all, as his darkest enemy. Where's the outrage, the anger, the desire for revenge that she, we, I feel, but he clearly does not? It's fashionable to talk today in scholarly circles about how traumatic memories get transmitted from one generation to the next. Literary scholar Marianne Hirsch has described this phenomenon as post-memory, in which children of Holocaust survivors take on the narratives and memories of their parents so deeply, it's as if they had the memory of the trauma themselves. For Hirsch, the primary way of transmitting these family stories are photographs, which collapse the temporal distance between the past and the present. I think of post-memory as an overflowing of memory from one generation to the next. But that's not what's going on here. What if there's an absence of memory? There's a surprising lack of scholarly interest in the phenomenon driving the letter from Cloudcroft, the motivation driving Melinda, but also that which drives many American Jews to travel to Eastern Europe looking for lost shtetls, or who find old family letters written in cryptic languages like Yiddish and desperately want them to be translated as some kind of connection to their past. This generation, the one not directly implicated in the Holocaust, yearns for a connection to American Jewish loss more generally. They yearn for ways to inscribe the totalizing power of the Holocaust onto their stories that are actually only tangentially about the Holocaust. Religion scholar Laura Levitt, in her book American Jewish Loss After the Holocaust, is not interested in the direct transmission of traumatic memories, but rather in their lack of transmission, in the silences of parents whose family stories seem too mundane to be worth transmitting, whose magnitude can't compete with those of Holocaust survivors. This lack of transmission leaves their children yearning for memory. Levitt talks about the process of finding memory in, think about this, home movies, books, photographs, and letters, and emphasizes that those materials are always personal, individual. Like Melinda, my parents and I also suffered from an absence of memory. My grandfather had made up a biography of being born in New York, when the truth was he was born in Ukraine and actually suffered through the traumas of World War I, a fact that our family only discovered when my grandfather was put on the truth about his background when my father was going up for security clearance to work on secret American military projects like the ones going on here. Our generation is indeed a haunted one, because American Jewish culture has made the Holocaust the barometer of loss and of American Jewish identity. This generation searches for connections, for its own losses revealed in family photographs, letters, and occasionally a story, often searching for a connection to the Holocaust. And in Melinda's case, she finds that her father's story does, in fact, connect with Nazi Germany in an almost ironic way, as she discovers that her father ends up working proudly with people who we would now call war criminals. We'll have to see the final film to see how Melinda engages this search for her father and this gap in time between 1946 and 2012. He was not traumatized by the Holocaust as much as we are, or at least he doesn't reveal the traumas the way we do. And his lack of transparency left a gaping hole, a loss, in Melinda's memory. And in the end, even if she wasn't born when they were written and her name isn't on the envelope, her father's letters are in fact addressed to her. Questions or comments or, yeah, please.
Just listening to what you said, and I don't think this has come up yet when we've talked about Sandy Hess. He was a military man. He was ordered to go to Fort Bliss, so we haven't really talked about, I haven't been in the military, and so I can't relate, but I would think that there's a component there that he may have looked at this differently than we are. I mean, this working with these German scientists, because he was representing the military and was on assignment. So there's something different in how you look at what you're assigned to do when you've taken an oath to the military.
Yes.
I mean, there's some sort of oath involved there.
Yeah, his universe of choice was, I mean, we were talking about choice and the moral people have. His was circumscribed. He's in the military.
He's in the military.
He has an order to go participate in this project.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so there's something there, too.